to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The greatest burden in today's debate are twofold. Number one, to show the impact of consumer company monopolies and show how that impact is detrimental or positive to our societies. But number two, we're going to show you how monopolies are the prime actors in solving African societies, even in bringing substantive impact for small businesses in African societies. We think in two instances. Number one, what this motion is not about. We think this motion is not necessarily about the protection of small businesses or minorities in this instance. We believe this is true because consumer African monopolies do not necessarily have the authoritative objective to cater for these monopolies, but to support minorities or small businesses that have the quality or have the standard in order to compete in the international market. We think in this instance is the instance whereby we see consumer company monopolies actually contributing to the benefit of society, and these are the ones that should better be proposed in society. But secondly, we don't think this motion is regards to anything regarding to colonialism or neo-colonialism or the use of international markets because of the existence of franchises, right? We think that in African instances, we have franchises and not necessarily subsidiaries, which means that these countries, these consumer companies, even though have an international brand, however, these are going to be run by Africans and necessarily will promote African interests for the development of Africa as a whole. Secondly, we think that when we're looking at consumer company monopolies, we're looking at, for example, Coca-Cola, we're looking at Pepsi, we're looking at Vodacom, we're looking at those big buzzwords in the business economy that when you actually hear of a drink, you'd rather hear of Coca-Cola. Those are the consumer company monopolies that we're referring to in today's debate, right? But another thing we need to note is that in African societies, we have very few to no funding structures that actually do exist for these small businesses that actually opposition probably is going to be talking about. We have very few little avenues of employment that government provides. There's very few employment opportunities or avenues of engagement that the government uses in order to impact the majority of African societies. We believe that not only non-government organizations as well as CSOs have the responsibility, but the whole factor that consumer company monopolies play a very large role, almost a greater extent, in providing the solution for these African economies. We believe, as from Team OG, that consumer companies form the backbone of African societies. We're going to explain this in 3 levels of analysis. Number 1, looking at the economical standpoint. Number 2, providing quality products. As well as 3, the social impact of these consumer company monopolies. With that, any clarification? Yes?
Should other companies be given the ability to be accommodated in the market if they show you a growth potential?
Panel, this is the whole reason for consumer company monopolies. We believe that if consumer company monopolies actually identify the growth potential of these companies, as I'm going to later explain in my point of analysis, we believe they actually support innovation strategies. These same Coca-Colas, we're talking of the Vodacoms, have innovation startups that actually allow these startups to grow, right? They identify, as we pointed out already, right? They identify the most probable companies that are going to make it in the economy and support them. This is because of the CSR. I'm going to engage that later on in my speech. We think, looking at the issue of innovation, right? We think these companies, because of the factor that they have, they feel that if we're going to promote the interest of these societies, these African societies, they will buy more into our products and to our brand. And this is the reason, for example, in Tanzania, we have METL, which is an African, which is a Tanzanian-grown monopoly, which is now African, right? They actually do provide jobs. They also provide social responsibilities to African societies to ensure that African societies will, number 1, buy into the impact that they have in the society, so that number 2, they can engage in their products. And this is the motivation that these consumer company monopolies will have in the first instance. But secondly, we think that these consumer company monopolies have an interest in developing the infrastructure that exists in these societies. This is because they exist in these societies, and if you're going to make sure that you take Coca-Cola to Karamoja, you need to make sure that if the government is going to come to you with a product, or to let's say we're going to develop that road, you have the same interest of ensuring that you engage the majority of of the population, which is what these consumer monopolies actually engage. And this is the reason why they have the incentive, because of the economies of scale that they actually have. Now, looking on economies of scale, we think that employment opportunities are greater on our side because local companies or small companies don't necessarily have the economies of scale to employ a large workforce. And even if they do employ this large workforce, we're talking of companies such as Shell providing even greater benefits for Africans, such as catering for their health benefits and catering to even other external benefits that they would have. And we think that, number 4, it prevents the issue of dumping goods from China. So we think that what these people provide is quality services. And the reason why they provide quality services and allowing these Africans to actually get into the services is to prevent the dumping of goods from China. My DPM is actually going to engage more on that. But lastly, we talk of the issue of remittances. Because of these consumer monopolies are actually international, it actually engages the opportunity for these local Africans or even individual Africans to work abroad. We think working abroad is actually good because it allows people to bring back remittances to countries. Of which, when you look at the financial structures of countries, remittances are a very large proportion of the amount of money that governments get or people get for the impact of society. And we only get this from consumer company monopolies. But secondly, on the issue of quality products, we think it not only provides quality products for consumers, which is actually beneficial, and governments have a standard or right to do that, but it actually helps local businesses in ensuring that the products are standardized. Number 3, we talk of the factor of CSR. The whole factor that are going to not only do it because they have the narrative of promoting their products, but they have a budget of CSR, which actually help governments in achieving their mandates. We think that when it comes to support of government, they actually help non-government, in achieving their issues. We think on the issue of human rights violations, if we come from OO, we think the issue of human rights violations is a very minority issue and should not be encouraged in this debate, because these people have an incentive to make sure that they have correct associations or relations with the government to make sure that they have greater impacts. But to also show you how the startup culture has actually even been prioritized through the establishment of regional infrastructures such as the East African Business Council. With that, I thank you so much.
Thank you to the Prime Minister. Call upon the Leader of the Opposition to start the opposition time.
Is my voice clear? I'm having
Loud and clear.
So I'm going to start. Just give me a second. Let's just.
There you go. Can you start when you start?
I know you're laughing. It's fine. I want the motion. I have the motion. Okay. So I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. When opening government makes this debate about the advantages of consumer-based monopolies, they fall out of this debate because they are largely uncomparative. Realize this, there is an important conception in this debate, and this conception is going to uniquely allow OO to win this debate. The conception is that there's continued existence of consumer company monopolies. These companies have been existing. They have made money. So they already existed in the past, like De La Mer. They've been making money since the times of the past in the 1980s in Kenya. It's a Dutch company that makes juice, right? What necessarily happens is they always exist because they've always occupied the market system, and the market system is theirs. To the extent, even if they're a colonial company, it's a company that necessarily has always existed and does not give any form of ability of middle-sized juice companies to be accommodated in the market system. The comparative is this: whether middle-sized company systems should be accommodated in this debate. But in this speech, I'm going to prove better economic growth, individually, uniquely to African countries, as a result of this integration, for a better and stable market system. If I prove that, I've won the debate. But then they don't give us a metric of whether surviving as a consumer-based monopoly and its existence looks like. They just say Coca-Cola. Okay, if Safaricom has grown in Africa, is it a consumer-based monopoly? Because again, it's a consumer-based monopoly in Africa because it originated from Africa and it's competing with a company like Airtel. The question is, when it exists as a consumer-based monopoly, we appreciate it. Safaricom is such a great company. But the question comparatively is, whether its continued existence is something we are willing to support. That continued existence in itself is a problem, because one thing, it's a barrier to entry for any form of middle-sized company like Airtel to enter the market system. But even secondly, it eliminates any growth potential of any company to be accommodated in the market system. Why is this important? 2 reasons. One, these accommodations means states will always legitimize Safaricom. We will always say Safaricom is the best company. We will all invest in Safaricom as the only company. In their world, that's what's going to happen. In our world in itself, the reason why we are accommodating it is because government itself is looking for an opt-out mechanism in case these companies fail. Monopolies fail. The Lehman Brothers in 2008 in the United States of America, that company failed because it existed as a monopoly in the real estate market system, and people lost job opportunities, lost their shares, and there is no return on investment or any form of opt-out mechanism or any form of alternative. But secondly, the reason why African market systems don't grow, this is very important. The reason why United States of America encourages competition in the New York Stock Exchange market system is because it has increased the behavior to accommodate middle-sized companies to compete with other bigger companies. That means, one, people can align their beliefs and people can align their interests and aesthetics towards those companies. People can invest in those companies because there is a form of growth of economies. And that's why the United States of America is always proud of its economic growing, because they never create barriers to entry in the market system. If they feel like Samsung, for instance, is a middle-sized company and needs to be accommodated, it means that accommodation itself will increase competition. But even it will increase the quality of services of Apple, because Apple now will be forced to accommodate this company within its market system, and its existence itself is very important. When Kenya now, or the market system in Kenya, supports the accommodation, because that's the alternative. In their world, there is no support of accommodation. There is support of continued existence. In our world, there is support of new existence and more accommodation to grow the market system. To that extent, it means you'll always be obligated to compete. You can't join the market structure if you are not competed. I asked them a very interesting POI. Why can't you accommodate? Because that's our world. We accommodate you, we give you the ability to increase, to enter the market system, we don't create that barrier. They say we'll offer CSR activities. That's not a debate. People want to make money. And that's why people are willing to grow companies in the different parts of the world. The reason why they want to build companies in the United States of America, it's because people know they'll be accommodated in the market system. In Africa, when you build a shoe, Nike has already accommodated the market system. There is a barrier to entry because Nike has always been there. Kipchoge was sponsored for Nike since 1920. He can't wear a Kenyan brand because the market system does not allow any other Kenyan brand like LNG to exist. This means, one, monopolies eliminate any form of opt-in mechanism and demand. They limit innovation. So you can't create anything. If you tell us to create a phone, you can't be accommodated because we've already glorified this form of thing. But even secondly, when we normalize it, it means other foreign companies will always tap into the market system in Africa. That's why Carrefour is displacing Tuskys, because we've created this behavior that the white people are brilliant, and that continued existence of Carrefour in Africa itself is something we still need. We don't need it. When companies like Tuskys, when companies like Naivas exist in Kenya, it means when they are being accommodated, we are increasing the ability of Kenyan companies to be accommodated in the market system. Comparatively then, we grow as an African economy, because if African Free Continental Trade Agreement happens, then Naivas is able to share with another supermarket in Ghana, and Ghana is supposed to share, and we sort of form this sort of free trade form of system.
Ali, at an instance where these startups you're talking about become...
So this is the problem. I know what you say. Sorry. So this is what will happen. This guy is going to argue about startups and everything. The problem why African startups are highly abused, because the media system, call-out culture, abuses Africa. They don't want Africa to develop. So the image of African social media companies and mainstream media companies does not give them the capacity to look good. And that's why African companies, even if they sell sugar, the media companies and mainstream media won't glorify it. But even secondly, the continued existence of westernized clothing systems itself is because we have refused to support and accommodate these accommodate smaller market systems, middle-sized market systems that are very important. Why continued existence is a problem. This is very important because it's our impact analysis that we do. But in the best case scenario, worst case scenario, in their best case scenario, in their world, monopolies survive. But in their worst case scenarios, smaller companies don't exist, so they die. As in our best case scenario, big companies, monopolies exist, plus smaller sized companies or middle-sized companies that have the ability to compete are accommodated. Airtel has the ability to compete with Safaricom, it is accommodated. But the problem is fivefold. One, it is a barrier to entry. You'll never be allowed to trade in the market system. Secondly, you bypass laws to regulation. That's why some people fear holding Safaricom accountable, because they fear losing their shares. They fear this is the biggest monopoly in East Africa. If Safaricom falls, it's game over. And that's why we create opt-out mechanisms like Airtel. We support the existence and not the continued existence. When you support the existence of Airtel money, it means monopolies can exist, yes, but with the sustainable competition. But secondly, we eliminate bigger companies from sidelining these middle-sized companies. Because why? We value competition in African systems because competition normalizes more accommodation. When you accommodate more tradable goods in the market system, the economy grows. We create more employment opportunities. We create more option economies. But even thirdly, we increase variability of choices. People can opt in into Airtel money and people can opt in into Telecom, people can opt in into Safaricom. We can't support continued existence when they've already made their money and that's all they care about. They have to support the comparative in this debate.
Thank you to the Leader of the Opposition, call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
So, beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, understand that whatever's coming from Ali's speech is to prove how we're going to create a market where small companies will rise into big companies. But the question is, what if they rise to monopolies? What will happen? Will we break them down to become smaller companies and bring the rise of other smaller companies? We think there is one thing we need to understand here. The sustainability of what they are comprising and the sustainability to hold the policies that we start. We agree naturally that if we break down a big company and let small company rise, what will lead then is to another monopoly to exist. So the structure is, how are we creating an environment where if monopoly exists, we are still going to benefit companies that exist on like a small scale, right? Understand this argument comes from three folds. One, that there is barrier to entry. Two, that it eliminates growth potential. And three, that it doesn't support accommodation of these small companies. So all these arguments is of the small companies. Understand that we live in a world of globalization with capitalists. We live in a world where Chinese, big companies in Chinese who have acquired economies of scale, import dumping goods that in Africa that are so cheap to an extent that the companies that exist in Africa cannot compete with them. And what's the instance if this happens? This happens that if we buy goods that are cheaper from the Chinese just because they have the economies of scale to produce cheap goods, we then export our money to those countries. So what happens at the end of the day? We have unfavorable balance of payments. So the metric on which they want to exist is a metric where they want not create a company that can act as a cushion to the African economy. And we think the only way we're going to have a cushion is if we have monopolies that are well regulated by the government to exist effectively in an African-driven economy, right? Understand three things that I'm going to run on a comparison. Number one, when we tell you that it's going to positively impact economies at a small scale and large scale, we mean on 6 levels of analysis. The first level of analysis is to understand that the only reason why these big monopolies are going to facilitate a startup culture is because they have the incentive to invest in research and innovation that will make them relevant in the economy. And if they invest in research and innovation that is going to make them more relevant, it means that we are likely going to have an economy which comes up with more ways to satisfy consumers. So let's think about how we're going to satisfy consumers about the products that these monopolies are going to make, right? But secondly, we need to understand if we are to protect the economy at the highest fold, we need to understand that the government, okay, will invest in structures that will ensure that small-scale companies rise. But you have companies like Coca-Cola who have the corporate social responsibilities and the incentive because they are told by the government to create digital spaces to allow companies to afford. I have a startup, it's called Rentify, it builds up. This startup works under Coca-Cola Digital Innovation and it's a monopoly that exists in Africa. It gives a chance for startups like me to grow. And this is why we think it's important to have these monopolies who can facilitate a space that the government can't facilitate. And at the best case scenario, we think the government is still going to create an environment where these startups are going to exist in the market. Just that we want an economy where these startups are going to come with ideas too good to exist in the economy. We want the consumers to get the best service, and this if a startup has a certain good idea that exists in the economy, we think it's going to rise eventually. This is the kind of startup environment we want to facilitate. Not a startup environment where we favor ideas that are not going to be like more utility to consumers. Let's think about the most important stakeholders, right? The consumers, right? But thirdly, we need to understand about the whole issue of them being large taxpayers and economic contributors to employment, right? In Tanzania, literally 17% of the employment opportunities are created by these monopolies. Breaking them down allows that small companies don't have the economies of scale and the incentives to allow and to employ most people than these monopolies. So if you break them down, most small companies, in order they want to create an economies of scale, they are like forced to employ less people to get more revenue at first. So what are we going to have on this side? On this side, we're going to have small companies that employ less people, and okay, in the long run they'll become monopolies, but they're always going to break them down because they don't like these monopolies to exist in the market. We think this is problematic. But fourthly, we need to understand how Africans can exist in an international market. When you have monopolies that can export, we're creating one thing. We're creating an attraction to our local currencies, and this enables us to have a currency powerful to compete in a capitalistic market, right? Let's not think about a soft market where we just want to empower small business that don't have that novelty idea. Let's engage in a market where we're going to create businesses that have the ability to compete for our countries. And this is what we want on the best case scenario, yes.
So if us as Africans continuously glorify colonial companies, does it mean colonial companies should stay to expand our own economies of scale?
No. Like, understand one point, right? At instances where we live in like a Tanzania society, what really happens at most instances is that, you see, companies that tend to rise are companies that have the ability to get government backup to rise, right? We need to understand one simple thing. Most companies like Nigerian bottling company NBC, the only reason why it franchises Coca-Cola is because Nigeria bottling company has found a way to franchise it to the country. So it's not really, the companies we are really talking about are not companies that are owned by some Dutch company who used to do extraction in South Africa. We're talking about companies that exist and have been franchised by the governments that exist in African nations, right? And we think this is are the most important companies to talk about, right? Okay, and even if an instances where we're talking about Dutch companies that exist in South Africa, I think the government has already implemented regulations that they benefit maximally from these companies to help these economies, right? Not at an instance where we raise companies that do not have an effective and a competitive economy, especially for an economy which wants to grow like the African's economy. We think that's crucial. But secondly, if we speak about the consumers on like a stakeholder analysis, we think consumers benefit more because of the quality of service and the incentive to monopolies to always exist in the market means that they're always going to produce quality services for the consumers. We think this is important. But secondly, for the startups, we think we're creating an environment where startups need to come with very novel ideas to beat them in the market. We think this is important because it's sustainable, because at the end of the day, a competitive market runs innovation and runs research to an extent that even the startups that are going to create it are solid. Like, for example, Zoom during COVID, the only reason why it got a very big market is because it could attain solutions that the world really needed. We think these type of startups are the startups that we need on our world. Startups that come with novel ideas to win the market, not startups that are favored just because the government wants to attain control in the market. I think this is important. But lastly, we also need to appreciate the existence of corporate social responsibilities, because at the worst case, we don't get how like small minorities are going to attain like a utility on our, but on our side we tell you that these companies have corporate social responsibility that build wells, that create like schools and stuff like that, which at least help the minority in the economy. So we think also these people are catered on our side. So on a complete stakeholder, on a complete cost benefit analysis, we think we got more benefits on our side, but at an impact analysis, we think the economy that's going to be sustainable and the economy that grows effectively, you get better on our side, and we think that's necessarily important. The main question to ask ourselves here is, even if we're going to give these chances of startups to exist, are we really giving them a sustainable environment for them to exist? But secondly, we need to understand, are we willing to break them up when there are monopolies in that market, when startups become monopolies in that market? Let's think about the sustainability of the economy. I rest my case.
Thank you to the Deputy Prime Minister. Call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Yahya.
I'd like to engage CG, your extension, if you are charitable. Please also make them silent, sleep your eyes. No antics. You, especially. Okay. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. I don't think we get much of why they support the continued existence. They just support monopolies, if you listen to the undertone. The way they're supposed to have looked at it is, what does the continued existence essentially mean? Not just for the small companies we talk of at OO, but also for the monopolies itself. What does that continued existence essentially mean? Let's engage DPM before I extend. He says, one, it means how best do we protect the economy? I think the one thing you need to understand here is what does African economies want? One, the liberation, which means that how do you get most of your population, which is in foreign employment, into actually one, either being self-employed or starting their own individual companies. They don't cater for that. They say that they need support to be successful. The problem here is that they say that all kinds of startups are going to fail because those ideas are fickle. That very understanding means that the kind of support meted out to them, one, isn't sufficient, but mostly the trajectory of these kinds of companies is threefold. One, there's a difficulty to establish. Ali talks to you about how there's a market capture that exists. But secondly, they don't have the funds to sustain themselves because it's a preferential way we treat these local companies. PM concedes that when you think of a beverage, you think of Coca-Cola. The problem is when a new company is established, even if they have better quality brands and whatnot, your mind already jumps to Coca-Cola. That preference means the continued existence of the small companies is threatened. They never get by. But lastly, they eventually die out. Telkom and Tuskys were major consumer monopolies in Africa. The consumer companies in Africa, they died out because the alternatives that exist, one, get the funding from GAF that Ali talks to you about, but most importantly, have been established in a way that they cannot fail. And I'm going to engage, they don't engage our best case scenario, all their lists are negative. But let's continue. Thirdly, they say that Africa exists in an international market. They say that they need to interact foreign investors. Note, the frame in Ali's speech means that the market has been captured. Why would investors come to a market that is already saturated? It makes absolutely no sense. So the increased investment on their side is flawed because it doesn't attest to, okay, the market is saturated, because they concede themselves that the market is captured by Coca-Cola and that sort of chat. But lastly, it means that it gives more help to minorities. This is tokenistic help because it doesn't give minorities the chance to get into business themselves. It means we build you schools and you're forever in our debt and gratitude. We don't allow your businesses to grow. We just kill them out by continued existence. Go.
You guys have been running advantages and disadvantages, which are hard.
Let me
But the
compare.
extension is that we think that these markets, consumer markets, are saturated. African countries need a different dimension of focus.
Very good. We need diversification, innovation, and at the end of the day, we need an alternative. So, how can African markets economically liberate? Two things: the diversification of their economies, which in itself is as a result of innovation and setting up of more different companies to offer alternatives that Ali talks to you about. But secondly, the incentive to enter market. Government needs to prove why there is an incentive to enter market when market systems are saturated. You can't say they're saturated then tell us that, well, we need more people to opt into market. But even if, right, they extend and say we don't really support their opting into market, it's going to be problematic, especially when I prove to you the worst case scenario on their side when these monopolies fail, what it means for employment systems in countries that are highly dependent on employment. The second thing is, why are workers more preferring to work for these companies and what's the problem? Three things: they pay better. The reason for this chair is that the smaller companies that are not consumer monopolies don't have the large economies of scale because of that preferential idea that you only buy from these monopolies. They never get enough money for them to pay their workers more, which means you opt into alternative employment, which pays you more. The problem here is that there's a singularity of power that exists. These individuals are most likely going to violate rules, as Ali talks to you about, but are never held accountable because they hold up the economy, and that in itself is a violation of human rights. Secondly, the accountability aspect I've talked about. Why can't small companies employ? They say small companies can't employ, and that's their biggest problem. I've already shown you what market capture means. You can't actually opt in. But secondly, the trajectory of your existence is that, one, you are hard to establish. Second, you don't grow. Third, you die and you're forgotten about, and we force more into employment slavery system. The last thing here is to say, what are large economies of scale and what do they essentially mean, and that preferential treatment. Second thing, right? I said silent, guys. Second thing, what does their failure essentially mean? Beyond the employees and whatnot, it means, one, we largely hamper the employment force. Their concession is to say that most of these people are employed. The problem is, if you essentially fail, that's their worst case, and we are being comparative here. If they fail, a large majority of the populace who, one, you've denied the alternative of setting up their own companies, actually going to be out of business, and that is problematic. But secondly, it means a major shock, because singularly, the monopoly is the backbone of your economy. That is essentially what they say. If it does fail because the economy is not diverse enough, it's not incentivizing entry, it means that if essentially fails. The problem here is that these individuals already have a small amount of expenses. They can't buy more, that sort of chat. Secondly, the preferential will means you've, one, denied them those alternatives, but most importantly, you've made the economy really in a very risky place, because if the monopoly fails, your company fails. OG is out. Let's actually compare here. What does Annie tell you before I take this POR? It talks of, one, state prioritization of these big monopolies because they are the backbones of their economy. Essentially, what this motion requires is to show why we don't support their continued existence, and not necessarily not necessarily what becomes of them or for us to provide alternatives. We just need to show how problematic their continued existence is. I've shown you one to the employer base, which is large, and likely, right? But what is the best case scenario on Gov? Gov could say that the continued existence allow people to say, get jobs and get money. The problem is small and medium business enterprises set up by locals never get to grow. Secondly, they are never held accountable. They can give substandard goods. KPLC can decide to take electricity and there's nothing you can do about it because, one, no other companies entered the market. Secondly, they can now give you substandard goods because you have no other alternative. So just to be comparative, on our side we get likely better outcomes for not just the smaller companies, not just for the government to hold accountable, for the economies to stay sustainable because you've pegged your existence on various other aspects. So even if closing comes to us, we say that this continued existence means we sustain the economies. I've already shown you why. The killing of competition itself, because it's never going to be on a level ground. They've amassed wealth because of their, I have 11 seconds. They've amassed wealth because of their continued existence. Is that a problem? God. They have amassed a lot of wealth, one, but secondly, they're bad entry into markets. So even FDIs and whatnot cannot come because of bad entry.
Thank you to the Deputy Leader of Opposition, one of our panelists, Mr. Paudc. Just to clarify the timing, our timekeeper does a double clap with a pause. So the double clap is like, they aren't clapping in or out. You can just hear that it's two claps, but there's a pause between them. Whilst we wait for the panelists, that brings us to the end of the opening half of the debate. In the meanwhile, can the member of the government get ready? We'll start as soon as the panel arrives.
starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, panel, there are a few things that we have to concede to in today's debate, right? So, there's a social reality that exists. Yes, African states are corrupt, right? Yes, markets are saturated, right? We need to understand that these things exist. We also need to understand that it's increasingly difficult for a lot of African states to engage in developmental projects that exist within their state, right? But not also, we need to also understand that there's a facade of competition that these guys want us to believe in, that when we open up the markets, people are most likely going to get a better chance to be able to engage. I'll show you how those things are most likely improbable on their side of the house, and why externally these monopolies constantly existed or have constantly been in existence over time, right? But then first, what is the social reality that exists and why we think this is important, right? So first off, aside the corruption that exists, right, most African states are incapable, especially when it comes to growing and dealing with development that exists, right? And we also have to understand that a lot of their markets are literally playing catch up to a lot of these consumer-based economies, right? So a lot of the local cereal production companies within Ghana are playing catch up to the likes of Nestle, right? The reason why this is difficult is because those markets already are saturated. There's no way that you can be able to constantly influence people to say, or you can be able to engage easily with these people and constantly for their addiction to want to engage within these things, right? The reason why this is important is because as African countries, right, we need to necessarily be able to engage with the world in the next phase, in a different dimension, because the already existing global markets that these guys want us to necessarily engage in are already saturated, are already very difficult for us to be able to engage in them. Because understand that these consumer companies, right, do not just exist within African states, they exist globally. They've already been established globally. These brands are already existed for so long, right? So it means that it's imperative for us as African nations to be able to find alternative, diverse ways to be able to engage with global markets, as opposed to a world where we constantly lie to ourselves and say, we can engage with these guys and we can engage with these guys competitively. We think that those things are flawed, think that their world is very, very problematic, right? But then, we also have to understand that Africans necessarily have huge raw products that necessarily need to be utilized, right? But we do not have the industry to be able to utilize these things, right? Think that the presence of these monopolies that have constantly existed have allowed us for ways to be able to give our products. I'll show you how necessarily that exists on our side, right? But then, right? Necessarily, right, what are the harms that these guys talk about that are most likely going to exist on our side, right? So these guys say, well, you're going to have things like influence by these corporations on your states, right? They capture the markets or whatever, right? The reason why, right, we think that that's in itself, even if that's our worst case, why we think we rather those things, right? Because we need to ask Africans to necessarily wake up, right? Because we cannot necessarily constantly lie to Africans that the reason why you're not developing is because Nestle exists within Africa, right? That is the problem, right? Because you can't constantly lie to Africans that, well, because of Nestle, you as an individual can't grow, right? Because understand, at the point at which Nestle entered into African markets, right, these guys started, right, they didn't just start cutting out smaller corporations and smaller businesses. The reason why they grew was because of a mentality that they had, right? Mentality of evolution, a mentality that said that they have to be the best in everything they do, right? That's why they constantly existed, right? Think that on our side, we allow for those mentalities to be able to grow in other African mentalities, right? So if necessarily you want to be able to engage within these markets, be as innovative as possible. Make sure that your products are something that necessarily people within Africa want to engage in, right? You don't think that constantly like people and say the reason why your market is not growing is because Nestle exists. You think that those things are flaws, those things are lies that these guys constantly perpetuate. You think that their word is very, very flawed, right? But then also understand, right? Relax, but then all panel also understand on the mentality of growth and evolution, why there's more likely a less incentive on these markets to be to crash down as all want us to believe in, right? So first off, these guys have constantly, over time, over period, done things to constantly ensure that they evolve, they fit into current systems. So you see things like Nike, you see companies like Nike that are going to green campaigns, like companies that always want to be as woke as possible to ensure that they still get huge market capture, right? We don't think that these companies have an incentive to want to do bad on the citizens or in areas that they try as much as possible to improve, right? Think that your word necessarily is at best a lie, right? But then panel at west, on our side, on the worst case, and why we think our side is even better, right? As these guys say, right? So panel, even if these guys have market capture, even if their only incentive is on profit, right? Why do you think our word is better? Because first, because of their incentive to gain as much as possible, they most likely tend to localize their production bases and whatsoever. So you look at things like Nestle building more factories and infrastructure within Ghana, right? Look at things like them looking to raw resources that exist, because these things are most likely cheaper, right? So it means that with this, right, they're able to ensure that they grow communities within these areas and allow for people to necessarily grow, right? What this means is also necessarily they're able to establish these businesses, establish corporations, allow for people to get more jobs, right? I'll show you how the evolution of these companies means that they are most likely going to do whatever it takes possible to ensure that these guys to ensure that their companies flourish, right? But then also we think that dominance also allows Africans to be able to wake up and say, look, these markets are already saturated, find other alternatives to be able to engage in markets. We don't think that these things exist within these guys' world, right? Let's go shoot.
So if they've been existing for 50 years, When will Africans wake up? After 100 years or 150 years? Give us a metric of success.
Yeah, so like, Pano, understand that the reason why these things happen is because, like this is very important, right? The reason why this now, Africans have begun to be waking up. So you see like a drastic pivot in what Africans are essentially looking to. So you see more Nigerians looking in fintech startups because they've noticed that like engaging within like the traditional market systems and all those things are not working for them. We've seen things like Ghanaians engaging like a lot of tech startups and all those things. They are beginning to wake up. We think that we should be able to support those things, right? But then, Pano, why do you think their award or their counterfactual is most likely very something we do not watch, right? Because understand that if you decide not to support the existence of these consumer monopolies, right, what it means is that you regret their continuous existence. What it means is that now you have active actions that are most likely going to break those monopolies. What this looks like is countries like MTN in Ghana who now increase their pricing on data bundles and whatever because the government of Ghana says you are a monopoly, we need to break you down. You give these guys an incentive to want to try to still break even with the kind of active actions that you most likely put on them. We think that active intentional action that exists on states are most likely going to be a more grave detriment to citizens themselves because we have to understand on our side we show you why we support these things. So if you don't support these things on upside, what it most likely means is that intentional action to want to break these guys down. If you decide to break these guys down, what's most likely happen is that they're most likely hurting more consumers. Think that those things are far more terrible on their side, right? But then, Pano, why the localization is a better thing on our side? Because you allow for these companies to be able to create communities that go a long way to improve how necessarily individuals within these communities grow. So you look at things like Huawei that invest heavily like improving on technologies students within Ghana, right? Companies like MTN who constantly train individuals or constantly train Ghanaians outside the country even to make sure that they get the necessary skills. They do these things to be able to improve like the human resources that exist within these areas, right? Those things are things you don't get from these guys because that active intentional action to want to break down that continuous existence, right, is one that's most likely going to disincentivize them from doing these things, right? We think that when we weigh these things, we're showing our worst case, we're showing our best case, right? These guys talking about our best case and also show us why their worst case is better. So I'm just proud to oppose.
Yeah. Thank you to the member for the government. What about the member for the opposition?
Okay, are we good?
Yes.
Okay, so beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. So panel, we think that OO has largely characterized what these consumer companies are likely to look, but let's add the nuances that they lose out on. Is that one, they are mostly the most profitable, largest, biggest companies in areas of essential need within the country, which means they have the highest market share by far. How do they become these monopolies in the first place? Is by purchasing other smaller companies or by entering other industries to spread their market share very wide across very major areas. Or 3, aggressively hiring competitor workers to ensure that they have the best of resource persons that exist within status quo. But then why is there a problem that CO comes into today's debate? It's one, on the kind of important infrastructure that they usually invest in or they usually exist in, is that they are completely controlled by these companies in essence. I've shown you how they are essential areas like telecommunications, which are important to the human existence within the state and the state in itself. Panel, understand that because of this nature, they have become largely too big to fail, or that's the mentality that exists within these spaces. These companies, like we said, have the highest market share by far and have a great economic impact that are dire in these states. We think that is a problem. I'll come back to that. But then note how that they are mostly very big within the status quo comparative to others and provide such crucial services that in the end, they end up controlling majority of what happens within these areas and create a dependency of the entire state and its entire populace on these particular countries in essence. The reason why this is very likely, and these are the areas that they usually tackle, is because they are one, largely very expansionist in nature in order to get the market share that we talk about. But then secondly, because they have the biggest brand recognition that exists and the kind of resources to also expand far beyond other companies. What then happens is that they start in an original sector, all right, like telecommunications, and then they begin to move into other areas where they're beginning to dominate these other areas. Panel, classic examples, MTN, Safaricom started as telcos.
But then in status quo, they are now moving into things like money, fintech, how they are now banks within status quo. They give out loans, they become investment companies within status quo, and they are not just becoming that, but they are also dominating within these areas, which I think it is important. The way up here is that we don't just say that their failure is bad and like existence that exists within this status quo, but then we show how they become so intertwined with these states and their people that every single action that exists with them becomes crucial to the survival of the state and its people. Beyond that even, is that three things. Is that one, because of their continued existence and their dominance, standards have dropped for them. Their continued existence has created a trust in them, such that they are in bed with the public service people, not even just the government, for example, but that these public servants, in essence, don't even want to change their brands that they work with, don't want to change the kind of ideologies they have about these things. But then also, what this has caused is that things like cross-checking, auditing, and these standards have significantly lowered because we just trust that they have existed for so long, they will continue to exist. So instead of them to be audited book by book, letter for letter, they are audited in general, and they are trusted to be doing a good job. What then happens is that they are likely to take more dangerous risks than status quo. What this does is that due to the brand, the fame, the trust, they become less cautious about the kind of investment that they engage in, and because their assumption is they are more guaranteed to succeed. Risk assessment is less factored in the kind of decision that they do, which creates a bubble. But the front panel, most importantly, examples, Evergrande in China was building without having the kind of money to support those kind of infrastructure, because they expected that because they are a big brand, they will get the money at the end of the day and they will continue. But what happened is they didn't get that money. Most of these houses are empty, which caused them an essential crisis in estates within China. We think that is the kind of problematic thing that exists within status quo. But then note, the debate is not just about the existence of these companies, but that their continued existence has caused conditions that lead them to death, which I've shown you already in the kind of analysis I've given to you. What are the impacts then that are very crucial that as Africa we cannot contain? Is that one, if they die, the economy dies, like in China. The difference, however, between Africa and China is that China can withstand the kind of pressures and shocks, but Africa cannot. And this is dangerous because it cripples the economy. People suffer, job availability goes down, standard of living goes high, inflation, so many things that affect them. We think that is very crucial. But then secondly, on the people that exist within the states directly, is that, for example, the investments of the people and how they, like most of these companies, for example, become fintech, go directly into these companies. In a sense that they die, all these people lose their livelihood that they've invested into them. Ghana, for example, has still not been able to pay the people that suffered from the men's gold scandal till today. They've lost their livelihoods and they are there. Before I continue, OG.
So how is Africa going to be relevant in a global capitalist
economy? Getting to that in a bit.
Getting
to that in a bit. So, Pano, the second thing is the threat to the state. And that's the assumption that even if they don't die, why do we even think they are worse off, or the state is worse off than anything that GAP argues? Is that one, because they provide crucial services, they are the only ones who dominate these areas, where they became monopolies. Like food, like telco, it means that these are things that people need every day at every point in time. What then happens, as I've said, is that scrutiny is impossible as the people themselves, these companies, can hold the state to ransom, something that you don't hear from the entire debate. So for example, take it this way, if Coca-Cola decides to stop pushing beverages into Ghana or in Kenya because we want to implement a more strict labor law protection, what this does is to fuck up your food industry in itself, because people who are largely interested or largely invested in these areas lose out. But then second, in status quo, just picture it this way, MTN, Safaricom, which are telcos, and no one has and they dominate within these areas. Once they go down, every single thing that is dependent on them also goes down significantly. What is even more important is things like state security, for example, which is highly dependent on things like telco, all becomes jeopardized within their world. But then even more important to African countries, like I said, it's because they don't have the laws and the leaders to bite back to these companies if these companies want to mess you up. What is the worst case in our world, which is what engages what they bring? Is that yes, possibly we'll not get so many jobs within status quo. Yes, the economy could be slow, production is slow. But then panel notes, this would happen for a while, and that's the bullet we are willing to bite. Why? Because the slow burn is important, because when we tell you that we don't support it, means we're telling them to slow down their expansion and restrict those kind of things that exist. But then this is more sustainable, and that's the point at which we are willing to bite the bullet. Because we prefer more sustainable options in a longer run. In a one where you tell them to scale down, you open up opportunities for other investments to grow, for other infrastructure that would be long sustainable, and the entire state is not dependent on it. So economy goes. We cannot sustain this because at the end of the day, more bad rep means more bad infrastructure or lower investor confidence within our spaces. We cannot have this existing within status quo. I'll be closing your position.
Thank you to the member for the opposition. Call upon the government whip to close up the government bench. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Okay. All right, so I'm starting my speech. So I'll take yours from both. Another time. I'm starting my speech in X, Y, Z. The problem with opening house is that they run advantages and disadvantages which are really, really parallel, right? But let's be fair. I think in the last part of Becky's speech, she was really comparative. I'll still show you why it wasn't enough in the entire speech in that regard, right? So, but the reason why we need to support the existence, the continued existence of these companies is the last part of Wesley's speech, right? Because she says that these people have far grown to the extent that if they break down, they are going to collapse a lot of employment opportunities and all that. Notice, the debate doesn't say, should we now allow these guys to go and protect their existence? The debate questions, they are already existing. Should we allow their continuity? It means that what Brain tells you is that if you don't support it, something nobody buys the bullet off. If you don't support it, it means that you are actively clamping their existence. It looks like what Wesley says, slow down their progress or to break down the economies. The impact of that is what Wesley tells you in her last speech. And what these guys also concede to. A lot of employment is going to be lost and a lot of things are going to come down. We don't think that we are ready to take that risk. But what is Wesley's response? Oh, the shock is going to be slow for a period of time, but will eventually come out. I'm going to show you from Brain's speech why the shocks, the coming out will not even be possible, right? But even if it's possible, the immediate backlash that governments are going to have from individuals is a big thing, and I'll tell you why, because of the de facto trust that these people have built with these companies, and then they wouldn't sit there for these companies just to be broken in that regard. Right. Let's start to see their cases and how they engage in run. So essentially they run first on how they think that there's a purchase, how these people came into power. One, there was a purchase of certain small companies and they have complete control in that regard. Two responses. First, these companies have become themselves localized. What do we mean? We mean that the MTN company and their product in Ghana are different from what exists in Kenya and are different from what exists in Nigeria. Why is this true? Because they have now adapted to the culture and norms of systems within these places. It means that even though these things are internationally owned and multinationally owned, they are owned by the individuals within those places. There is no incentive for certain state capture because already people have given de facto subscription to these companies. They are now part of the communities and societies in that regard, right? But two, it means that people have long-term trust for these companies because now everybody calls Nestle and like we see them as a part of our community and society. People even have nostalgic feelings when they see Nestle in that regard because of how they grew up with these things, right? What does it respond to again? It means that for the things about, oh, let's break them down, it's just a short thing, people are going to by de facto come against it on backlashes because they don't see the essence of wanting to break down MTN when MTN is supporting us. What is your excuse, Nana Akufo-Addo? Oh, my excuse that these guys are capturing the state. I want other developing, small companies to develop. I'm going to show you why those small companies cannot. Let me even answer that here. What does Brain tell you on those small companies? There's an already existing saturation for consumer-based production. What does it mean? There's a high competition on the global scale on things like consumer-based. For you to be able to survive, you need a large economies of scale that these guys have already built. What it means for these guys is they are constantly now going to start these companies from afresh. You can't compete. You will fail because you don't have that same level of economies of scale. It means that people are going to come up against you more. So even though you give these people an opportunity, they can't. What's the comparative? I want this, diversify on other things. Why is that true? Ben tells you other people, now Ghanaians are more concerned about tech, now Ghanaians are more concerned about, Nigerians are concerned about other things. that idea that we can only survive on consumer base should be clamped out. Then Wesley says MTN is now focusing on other things, they're capturing other places. That is intuitive. What is it? Credit these guys for that. They tell you that MTN gives scholarship for innovative and startups and all that. They are more supportive to the other diversified ideas because their continuous existence diversifies the plowing in of capital to other startups in other places. We don't think that there's state capital at this now. Now, the next thing they talk to you about is, oh, do you think that there's less accountability and less risk taking in that regard? Like, guys, listen to this, because I think it's one of their biggest keys. Less risk, they take silly risks in that regard, and they end up anyway. One, these companies have aims and objectives and are capitalists. Listen, Elisha. It means that they are not silly to want to just invest into anything. But two, when there is an effect of loss, it affects the companies first before it affects the state. It means that there is an incentive for them to take wise risk. So even for you, the state are affected, they are affected. So their continuous assistance means that they are already risk takers, that they are more reasonable in taking policies. It scraps out the idea of, oh, they are going to take silly risks and they are all going to come down. But then, even if they are going to take a silly risk, the reason you should support them to continuously be better off, because when instantly they fall, you understand that all your employment opportunities and all are going down. How do states revive these things? These people say just establish other small companies and automatically will get. The question is, if you have the money to do that, you would have done it already. If you have the money, invest into other sectors, right? You don't think that consumer base are the only thing that are existed. Ali said. The next thing then we talk about is, oh, they think that these people are threat to states in that regard. One, before they told you that people prefer these things because by de facto they are supportive of it, right? So even if that you think that state sovereignty is being crumpled upon, state sovereignty thrives from the people. The people have subscribed to MTN, constantly subscribed to Nesto. They have had opportunities, they have been built, houses have been built for them in that regard. We think that people have by de facto been able to consent to these things. The state is only threatened when people are threatened. Once the individuals are comfortable with these companies in that regard, we think that it's better. They could have better then said that, oh, the prices are going to go high in that regard. Why are they better? Because one, they are multinational companies that do not have incentive of increasing prices because they have more economies of scale. That's why they constantly put in corporate social responsibilities, right? So they are more protective of individuals within the state in that regard, right? So they don't have any incentive. But Brain tells you before that.
So my question is, when Carrefour absorbs all the companies and swallows them, how does your one accommodate any other alternative?
Because those companies, if they are going to exist, can't compete on the international market because the consumer base is saturated. Brain already tells you that. Because then, if they have, what's the possibility that they couldn't invest into other technologies, other tech startups? Because MTN will support you if you invest into other things. So why don't you go and invest and they support you? Ali, is that difficult? So now the next thing is that, like, you should understand that these people, right, have the legitimacy from the people, so there's no threat for them in that individual. They are saturated in that regard and all, right? What do these guys argue? They say there are barriers of entry. I think we've sufficiently answered that in that regard by showing you that these people created the competition through things like good pricing and quality products. We don't think that if other small companies can provide, they should just provide the good quality and quality product. We don't think that MTN took guns and shot everybody and died, and then they said that we are now the ones in power. They had these things legitimately, right? They invested and they are plowing back. We don't think that it is illegitimate for you to say they are not going to be better. But then the biggest case then again is, what if they fail? We are all going to go down. Why wouldn't they fail in the first regard? One, multiple streams of revenue, because even if the entire company of Ghana fails MTN, there's Nigeria to supplement them, right? But they have connections and trades that can always put them in this regard. Remember that we are the world that is compacted and absorbs all the bad things. These guys are parallel and gives you advantages. We show you how our world survives in whatever instant. Proud government.
Like, what opposition vote, you'll just start your speech hopefully.
question was that. Okay, before I start, funny thing, for a team that has the last word, no one wanted to take POIs from us, so let's see. Anyway, let's go. Going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, while we weigh over opening opposition, a couple of things. So Ali actively mentions that these companies are going to die, and that is the extent to which he talks about their death. Because he then speculates on a lot of impacts that could happen and says that they are going to die. What we do in this particular debate is that we provide the mechanisms that exist because of the continuous support. So we provide 3 mechanisms. One, we tell you their expansionist nature, which means that they are intertwined with other forms of important essential services in the state. The fact that they don't stay in only telecommunication, but they end up in places like banking, etc., which means that that particular death is possible and is going to happen in a way that affects people. The continuous support of these particular monopolies is what makes it likely, because they continue to enjoy more profit margins, which allows them to have more profit to expand into other industries. Important mechanism from us. Secondly, they don't get the same amount of scrutiny, and OO's impact on this particular scrutiny conversation is to the point of employment. But here's the difference. The difference here is that we tell you that the lack of scrutiny means that the standards for them continue to fall. So auditing, etc., quality of products, etc., continues to fall. But the third thing that is extremely important is the conversation about risk. And CD's best response to that is that they are capitalists, and so they are going to be wise. That is false. Capitalists consistently have never shown to be wise when there's a possibility of profit for them to make. What that looks like is the Lehman Brothers he talks about. The entire banking crisis in 2008, and this is where the impact and the conversation actually happened only because the banking industry recognized that they had such brand recognition that they could promise to give people a particular amount of interest without actually having that particular interest, thinking that they are going to make a lot of money and that interest will be possible in the future. Recognize Evergrande, for instance, they didn't have money to build their houses, but they said they were going to build their houses anyway because they thought if they made the promise, people would invest anyway. Recognize in a world where they are so profitable and they have the brand recognition, nobody questions anything they do. They are going to see profit and their eyes is going to blink, and it's going to cause them to take riskier decisions, which is going to screw the nation up. What will the impact of this be? We tell you 2 things, right? We tell you that the economies are going to die and it's going to be very detrimental to the state. The reason why this impact makes more sense is because of the characterization and the mechanisms that we give you, which includes that 1, they are very expansionist. That means they are intertwined. So it's not just telecommunication dying, but it's the entire banking sector dying. But the next thing that we tell in this particular debate is that Africa has bad rep. We can't afford to have more shots in our economic system. What that means is that we don't have the ability to take more bad PR in terms of investment in our economies in status quo. So if we see something that could cause problems, we need to deal with it now. We tell you that even though China and the USA responded after big companies failed, it is unlikely that will happen on our end because we are not so important geopolitically, and so they are just going to move on to the next African country. If Ghana fails, Nigeria is there. I'm not quite sure why anybody will invest in you after you made some mistakes. Very, very important in showing how we are different. But additional things that we bring in this debate that they don't, right? 1, the security threat. It's very important. In principle, it's against everything that Africa stands for. The independence of African states. This is not slavery by our colonizers, but slavery by companies being owned by our colonizers. Recognize that our sovereignty is directly on the line because we've explained to you that these particular countries control essential companies, control essential services like technology. For example, in Ghana and Nigeria, you see a lot of people tweeting on Twitter or later after the internet comes back that I wasn't on the internet the whole day because MTN is down. That is what it looks like. Your entire telecommunication infrastructure is dependent on one company. Why this is very bad for African countries specifically because we have leaders that are so bad, like dogs that can't bite. So you can't really do anything, it's a problem. Finally, we engage the worst case scenario of what the world is going to look like in our world, and I'll do a comparative about the worst case scenario when I engage the rest of the teams. OG is out in this debate for a couple of reasons. Their biggest argumentation is that these people are funding big companies. There's a huge logical gap. For a company that is very big in society, why would it equally fund a competitor? What happens is that they buy them out. I'm not quite sure why Coca-Cola is going to sponsor Pepsi. That's how it works. They don't fund them. They buy them out. What then happens is that recognize what they say is largely false because all the examples they give are largely state interventions. Coca-Cola doesn't have an incubator program in Ghana, and the largest amount of investment all African companies receive It's external. Recognize all the TechCrunch articles you see of Kenyan companies, Nigerian startups making money is from foreign investors, not the local investors that they talk about, because Safaricom has no reason to sponsor another money-sending company. The logical gap is huge. But recognize their world kills external investment totally. Why? It's very simple. In a world where Safaricom, if they claim is a Kenyan company, or there's a Kenyan company or local company that has become a unicorn or a monopoly, what happens in their world is there's absolutely no need for anyone else to invest in new companies in the same area. Not just because they can't compete, but recognize that most of these venture capitalists and investors would have already invested in these big monopolies already, and they don't have any reason to add another smaller company to their portfolio if that particular company can't compete on the same scale. So what then happens is that these VCs just push the big company to buy the smaller company, and that's the end of the conversation. You're funding that things exist, you have absolutely no impact on your world. A couple of things that they also argue that I'm going to respond to like quickly: remittances, work abroad, bro, that is not exclusive. Remote jobs exist. Like, I'm not quite sure why we need to cripple our economy just because of remittances. They are not dependent on these things. So many solutions can happen. It's not exclusive to your world. They also argue things like, we are going to have health benefits. Recognize these companies are not the best at taking care of their employees because the standards are low from them. You fail on that particular one, OG has no case. But then OG's entire case is why we win this debate. But before that, OG.
The Africa Business Council is largely funded by Coca-Cola. In your world, what is the scapegoat for these small companies?
You realize that that particular example that you gave is funding a council that is supposed to do I don't know whatever, but that is not giving people the opportunity to fight Coca-Cola. It brings into my case like Coca-Cola will not fund other companies that are trying to compete with them, and we've shown you why these particular areas are important. Like, you can't bring these responses, right? All this case is why we win the debate. If they say these companies are needed to fund smaller companies, then our case makes a lot of sense. Because if the entire funding of all the smaller companies in your state is dependent on companies that can fail, and we've shown you are likely to fail in our state, then that then means that we need to stop that, because in your world, if they fail, all smaller companies fail, we have no alternative at all, closing opposition with. Finally, to CG. CG's case is really interesting. They say we need to allow these companies to be monopolies so other people can then involve themselves in other companies in other areas. Our case response to this is very obvious. You can't go competing with people who are having so much money and have so much money in their banks that they can outbid you and outbeat you in all other industries. They're going to expand. If there's money to be made, you can't respond to that. But secondly, they say, we're going to clamp down on them, and that is a bad thing. That's not bad. What then happens in our world is that at worst, their profit margins decrease. That does not kill the company because they're already making so much money already. I'm not sure why a 10% decrease or 5% decrease in MTN shares would end up fucking MTN up forever. Recognize our world is the only world that saves investor confidence in Africa and ensures that African states are able to be sustainable forever. Closing opposition, close this debate.